Hello, my listeners. This is Mubilu Musoke with another conversation on democratization of Africa. The case of Uganda in comparative perspective. The last conversation we had, I was talking about the character and the personality of Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. It's important for us to understand the personality of a leader, because whatever the leader does actually springs from his personality. If a personality is not trustworthy, the leader is not going to be trustworthy. And the theme we have been pursuing is to examine the character and the personality of Yoweri Museveni using the text he wrote himself in sowing the mustard seed. The last conversation ended with an analysis of FRONASA as an organization, and we looked at how it was formed, how it was organized, and what its functions were. I'm going to continue the same conversation with the UPM. The UPM was formed by Museveni and his colleagues in 1980. The circumstances under which UPM was created are explained by Museveni in a way that reveals Museveni's character and duplicity. You can never take Museveni's words at face value. He wrote, quote, "Any person who was neither greedy for power nor politically and ideologically myopic should have seen that the only viable option for Uganda at the time, that's 1980, was a broad-based government in which all these factions could have attempted to work together. It would then have been easier to contain the adventurers in the various opportunistic groups. We who were advocating unity," Museveni writes, "were placed in a dilemma because, given their past history, we could not possibly have joined either the UPC or the DP." Unquote. You do not need a psychiatrist to analyze this statement in order for you to understand that Museveni is not a truthful person. There are four important elements in the quotation above which need to be carefully we need to carefully examine, because they are directly related to the creation of UPM. These elements are greed for power, broad-based government, containing the adventurers, and various opportunistic groups, which Museveni refers to. For Museveni to condemn greed for power is the irony of all ironies. It is possible Museveni was not fully aware of what he was writing about. Let us take a closer look. Due to greed for power, Museveni amended the 1995 Constitution in order to allow him to run for the third term after being in power for 20 years. Tell me, who else is more greedy for power than Museveni himself. From the beginning in 1986, Museveni suppressed political freedom so that he would dominate the political process. The subconscious motive for the policy of broad-based government must have been political greed, ironical as that may sound. Without political competition guaranteed by political freedom under a multi-party system, the facade of broad-based government allowed Museveni to systematically suppress the freedoms of association, assembly, and expression, using the false argument legitimized by an invalid social theory that sectarianism was inherent in multi-parties in all backward political systems without a middle class. Multi-parties caused sectarianism, Museveni argued, and therefore multi-parties had to be suspended as a matter of principle under NRM broad-based government. I know that many people bought this argument, but in retrospect, I condemned it then. I knew what it meant, but now I think all of you can make a judgment for yourselves. Under broad-based government, no one could have been greedier for power than Yoweri Museveni. Museveni used broad-based government to eliminate political competition. Similarly, characterizing Ugandan leaders in 1980 as suffering from myopic ideology is a contradiction in terms. Museveni has so far deliberately refused to reveal his own ideology. It may be far better to believe in a myopic ideology openly than either to have no ideology or deliberately disguise one's true ideology as Museveni continues to do. The latter behavior verges on political dishonesty and deception. Thirdly, in his book, Museveni is using the concept of broad-based government retrospectively. In 1981, Museveni was more interested in grabbing political power than in broad-based government. UPM was not formed on principle either to advance philosophical objectives or to achieve a rational ideological goal Museveni was committed to. That is why Museveni went to the bush in 1981 after losing the election, supposedly to fight for democracy, but in reality to fulfill a personal political ambition. Lastly, the concept of containing the adventurers in various opportunistic groups is pregnant with the political meaning. Museveni's policy to suppress political freedom is ultimately justified and explained by the idea of containing the adventurers. Museveni does not philosophically believe in political freedom. We all know that by now. I knew that in 1986. The lack of political philosophy is aggravated by ideological ambiguity we discussed earlier. The result is unrestrained suppression, which has been manifested in the suppression of freedom to assemble and associate throughout Museveni's presidency. The most recent example of containing adventurers is the brutal suppression of walk-to-work demonstrations in 2011, in which children and pregnant women were shot and peaceful demonstrators were sprayed with chemicals and dye. Museveni argues that he and his supporters who formed UPM had only two options in 1980. One alternative was, quote, to stay out of the elections altogether and consolidate our presence in the armed forces, unquote. This option was based on the belief, ultimately, that the politicians will fail. And when they do, quote, we could use military strength to get rid of the whole lot of them, unquote. That is Museveni writing. Use military strength to get the whole lot of them. Excuse me. This arrogant statement is both a revealing and a frightening thought. It reveals a hidden aspect of Museveni's personality. It means that Museveni believes in the legitimacy of military coup d'etats in the same way as Idi Amin and Milton Obote did, and therefore Museveni would not hesitate to use military muscle in order to achieve his political objectives. The legitimacy of political objectives is irrelevant to Museveni. The logical conclusion of such a thought is that Museveni, deep down in his heart, does not believe in the legitimacy of the electoral process. That's why he has rigged elections in 1996, 2001, 2006, and 2011. In each of these elections, he made sure that his opponents were intimidated and there was no level playing field. Indeed, Museveni's belief in military power as a political solution is clearly reflected in how he has concentrated military power in his hands since he came to power in 1986. Excuse me. In fact, Museveni's ascendancy to power in 1986 after Tito Okello had overthrown Obote in 1985 was as opportunistic as it can be ever get. Such behavior can only be explained by the total absence of a political philosophy to guide rational political action. In 1980, Museveni personally favored, quote, keeping out of the factional fights altogether, unquote. But Museveni's supporter allegedly favored the creation of a third political party. Quote, following intensive pressure from Bidandi Sali and Kategaya, I agreed to associate myself with the Uganda Patriotic Movement, UPM, unquote. UPM, as a result, was born in 1980 not for philosophical or ideological reasons, as Museveni himself explains, but the expediency of pursuing power using political structure Museveni controlled. Among the prominent members of UPM were Jaberi Bidandi Sali, Changa Macho, Joshua Mugenyi, Father Okoth, Jeremiah Opira, Elisa Chironde, Rhoda Kalema, Sam and Gertrude Njuba. Almost all of these prominent leaders once belonged to UPC, with the exception of Sam and Gertrude Njuba. This fact is important because those leaders, including Museveni, may be philosophically contrasted with the members of DP, which was to be expected, and they were very close to UPC ideologically, notwithstanding Museveni's political rhetoric. UPM could therefore ideologically be regarded as a branch that conveniently broke away from the main trunk, UPC, in order to grab a new political opportunity. This does not seem to be a political accident, as we shall attempt to demonstrate later. Having formed the UPM, Museveni and his colleagues immersed themselves into the political campaign of 1980. Museveni predicted the fate of UPM at the polls, probably retrospectively, after the shock of the results subsided. There were no chances of UPM winning the elections. Museveni had conceded defeat. Museveni's prediction was compatible with the actual results. UPM won only one seat in parliament. Not even Museveni himself, leader of the party, won his race. Quote, the DP had the majority of popular support in the areas of West, Central, and Eastern Uganda and Arua. The Ugandan people had hoped to defeat Obote through the ballot box and formed a great anti-Obote coalition involving the original members of DP, mostly Catholics, those who had belonged to the Kabaka Yeka, those who had deserted UPC, and those who had no political affiliation. All these various factions, Museveni writes, chose the DP as the easiest political defense against the threat of Obote's return to power, unquote. Then Museveni concluded that, quote, with the elections rigged as we had predicted, we had to start preparing to fulfill our pledge to go to the bush and fight for injustices that had been inflicted upon our country. That sentence is pregnant with lies. Injustices inflicted upon our country. What injustices and who suffered the injustices? It's certainly not UPM, and the DP was the one that lost the polls to UPC through rigging. Nowhere does Yoweri Museveni point to sectarianism as the cause of the results of the 1980 elections. Why? The theory had The question that needs to be answered is, where did the UPM, personified through Museveni, without a political philosophy and ministerial support in the country, derive the legitimacy to go to war for rigging the elections in which UPM admittedly performed very poorly? Was this a matter of political principle or political greed and opportunism? The actual rigging did not affect UPM political fortunes. It adversely and unjustly affected the DP. This was common knowledge, equally embraced by Museveni and other objective observers. It is important to point out that even before the election on December 10, 1980, Museveni had Plan B in place. Quote, as we had predicted, the elections were rigged. During the campaigning, I had taken the chance to warn the UPC that they should be prepared to face the consequences of a rigged poll, unquote. The irony in that statement is beyond belief. It is a confession to possessing political greed and a total lack of political philosophy guiding political action. Museveni was certainly not pronouncing profoundly philosophical ideas. He was being opportunistic, as usual, at best. In fact, in his complaints against Mwanga's government, Museveni was whining about what he was to be accused of later when he assumed power himself. For example, one of Museveni's complaints against Mwanga was that Mwanga's government refused to amend the electoral law, hoping to use its loopholes to cheat through double voting, switching ballot boxes, false counting, gerrymandering constituencies, and hooliganism, and so on. My own constituency in Nyabushozi was gerrymandered, taking advantage of the fact that voting was likely to be on a religious basis. The sub-counties of Nyakashara, Sanga, and Nyabushongi were removed from cattle-keeping areas, and they were exchanged for Ibanda County, which is occupied by Catholics. That's Museveni writing. We have already made a comment on this issue earlier on in another conversation, so we don't need to go into it in depth. The fact that later on Museveni behaved exactly as Mwanga, whom he complained about and accused of unfair electoral practices, means that Museveni does not behave according to principle. His political behavior is not guided by political philosophy. It is apparently opportunistically driven by the personality defect that blindly pursues political power at any price, deception being one of the effective devices he uses. In fact, as soon as Museveni started the Bush War, he forgot about the existence of UPM altogether. This means that UPM was founded either on a philosophical belief. It was founded neither on a philosophical belief nor on an ideological objective. Therefore, Museveni did not wage war in the name of UPM or on the argument of having been unfairly cheated in the election of 1980. UPM was never mentioned as a reason to go to war for having been cheated of victory in the 1980 elections. The war was an excuse for Museveni as a means to grab political power. After the war, for example, UPM as a political party was not revived. Instead, Museveni blamed all political parties without exception for practicing sectarianism, as we demonstrated in earlier conversations. There was no reason for Museveni to call UPM a sectarian party, since it was formed by Museveni himself on a non-sectarian basis, we believe. There was no principled reason given for abandoning UPM, except for the fact that UPM could not deliver political power to Museveni. Not only did Museveni and his supporters create UPM supposedly to avoid sectarianism in the other inherent in the old parties, DP and UPC, but we know that UPM did not exist in 1960s and therefore could not be blamed for past sectarianism. Therefore, associating all political parties per se in Uganda with sectarianism, apparently including UPM, especially by invoking his invalid social theory, was merely a political trick on part of Museveni to suppress political parties and thereby avoid political competition from the opposition. In fact, Museveni's big loss in 1980 elections reinforced his suspicion of political freedom and the free and fair electoral processes in general. These points become more self-evident when we look at another political structure, National Resistance Movement, NRM, also founded by Museveni. UPM was purposely abandoned because it could not be used effectively by Museveni to grab and monopolize political power. Now we'll focus briefly on NRM and so-called democratization. NRM was formed through the merger of People's Resistance Army, PRA, Museveni's military organization, and Uganda Freedom Fighters, Dule's military wing, by their leaders Yoweri Museveni and Yusuf Lule, respectively, signing, quote, a protocol effecting the merger of the PRA and the UFF in 1981. Museveni commented on the deal, that is the uniting the two organizations, that, quote, Lule really had no forces to speak of, but we were prepared to be flexible and did not insist too much on maintaining our own identity. Apart from his image, Lule had no other contribution to make. However, since some of the Ugandan people would be happy to be identified with him, we were willing to change our identity and create a new body to accommodate him. Wow. Playing politics of generosity. Museveni's narrative deliberately minimizes Lule's military contribution by reducing it to his political image alone. The fact is that at the time of the merger of PRA and UFF, Lule had a substantial group of fighters in the bush. One of the leaders of UFF was Mutebi Nekemia Guedeko, who was based in Luweo, where the war was to take place eventually, which became the center of the war for 5 years. Guedeko is credited with brokering the merger of PRA and UFF at Matuga. Many of the fighters in UFF had rejected the idea of the merger between the two groups because of Museveni's role in Lule's overthrow in June 79. Guedeko, who became the NRA second in command, signifying the importance of UFF at the time